Good evening. Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. I'm Dallas Jones.
And I'm Jay Aiyer.
Today, we are going to be discussing relations between the U.S. and Mexico. We watched this week as President Trump delivered his State of the Union. And while it was an American speech, our neighbors to the south were a big topic of discussion. And so we are joined today by two experts, Dr. Laura Murillo, President and CEO of the Houston Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and Dr. Tony Payan, Director of the Mexico Center at the Baker Institute at Rice University. Welcome to Red, White, and Blue.
Thank you.
So I'll start the conversation with asking this question. We heard a lot of talk about border security. We've seen our government shut down recently as a result of more border security or more funding for aspects of border security. Is there a need to put a wall at the southern border of the United States, and are we less safe today?
Right. Well, let me start with that, because I think it's important that everybody understands that there are 654 miles of some kind of barrier along the U.S.-Mexico border from California all the way to El Paso, and then some portions of Texas. The president has proposed another 1,000 miles. It's not clear, as with Mr. Trump, hardly anything is clear, whether that 1,000 miles that he's proposing includes the refurbishing and rebuilding of these 654 miles, or they're completely new. Texas is 1,200 of the 2,000 miles of U.S.-Mexico border. So building a wall between Texas and Mexico is very difficult. There's a river there. It's almost impossible. And I can tell you that it's very difficult for the president to make a case for a border wall and to make a case that there is a national emergency, as he has, when all the numbers are going in the right direction. Crime is down, the border is a relatively safe place. The cities on the border are very safe, as per the FBI Unified Code of crime in the country, and immigration is way down. Undocumented immigration is way down. All the numbers are going in the right direction. It'll be very difficult for the president to argue that it's needed.
It's truly just a distraction from what's really happening in this country, all of the investigations that we are very well aware of. This is a distraction tactic, and he is marginalizing an entire country and many people who were born in this country who have roots in Mexico. And at the end of the day, it's also an economic impact situation that we're dealing with. Because of this, we have many people who were furloughed, who lost wages. Many things were affected by that. And once again, if you look at the numbers, everything is moving in the direction of the fact that, yes, we need to continue to have border security. A wall does not make any sense. We have other issues which are much more important, such as health care, all kinds of things, homelessness. And to take up so much of the time in terms of dialogue on an issue that is really just a distraction from the real crisis in this country, which has some legitimate concerns as it relates to security, cybersecurity, and other measures that have been really overlooked in this dialogue, are certainly what we should be discussing.
Jay?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the questions I have is, I know that the cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico has increased in terms of dealing with the migrant issue. There's been, I guess there's been calls to have processing of potential refugees in Mexico. How is that working with the new president, Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, as he's commonly known? How is that interacting with him? How is he dealing with working with President Trump? Tony?
Well, you know, clearly, I think it's not the same kind of relationship that Mr. Peña used to have with President Trump through Jared Kushner. It's a much more complicated thing. I think Mr. Lopez Obrador doesn't mention the United States, doesn't talk about Trump. He couldn't care less about what's going on in the United States. He doesn't talk about the wall. He considers that it's a prerogative of the United States to build that wall. And so President Lopez Obrador dedicates very little time to the binational relationship. So the binational relationship is really set by the United States. It's about the initiatives that the United States brings to the table. And here's where the problem lies. Let's take a look at the USMCA, for example. That needs to be put through Congress. It is a slightly better agreement than NAFTA, for sure. Where it is worse is in those very things that President Trump fixated on. Those things are probably worse in the agreement, but there are many other components that were added to it that are probably better. But he needs to shepherd that through Congress. He's opening battles with the Democrats and shutting down the government and so on without finishing the projects that he's already got on the table. That's a big issue. The other problem is that we do not understand how the Central American immigration problem is going to be dealt with for a very simple reason. The foreign minister in Mexico and the White House have apparently agreed implicitly on a program that is called Remain in Mexico. The immigrants will stay in Mexico while they apply for asylum in the United States. And the United States will deport individuals from Central America to Mexico. The INM, the Mexican Immigration Institute, which is the equivalent of that old INS in Mexico, has that there is no such an agreement. In the meantime, Mr. Lopez Obrador is offering one-year visas for Central American migrants in those caravans that the president talks about to stay in Mexico and work in Mexico while they work on their asylum case in the United States. But we haven't seen any documents. We haven't seen any explicit agreement, any accord signed by the two administrations. So everything remains sort of in the dark.
And having been at the inauguration, it was very interesting to note that not only is the new president not talking about Trump, but most of his key administrators were not doing it either. They were talking about opportunities to collaborate with other countries, as we saw the King of Spain who was there. We saw many people from Asia and other places who were there trying to find opportunities to do business, while the United States is still stuck in this conversation, which is a fabricated conversation about immigration and this wall that is truly a not needed entity and is certainly taking up a lot of our time.
How do we shift the dialogue? I mean, a lot of this is coming from the president. You're saying the new president in Mexico is not even addressing or paying attention. How do you all work for institutions that really help to push the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico forward?
Yes.
How do people shift the dialogue and understand, that we are not being threatened by this idea of this Mexican invasion is essentially what the president has framed it as. How do we change that?
So one of the ways that the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce has tried to do that is by attending the inauguration. We were only one of 70 who were there in the room and actually had the opportunity to visit with CEOs and other executives here in the local Houston area in oil and gas to find out how we can connect the dots between Houston, our technology, our infrastructure with Pemex. We all know that there's a huge need for American technology, expertise, et cetera. That's an opportunity specifically for jobs and economic opportunity for Houston. However, having said that, we all know that Pemex has been reluctant to have outside private companies enter Mexico and take care of their many needs. But again, this is where individuals and organizations are at the table, bringing people together. And it's even more important now when we have presidents who are so far apart from one another. It's going to take individuals, organizations working with those cabinet members.
Tony, would you talk about that, and specifically the point that Dr. Murillo just said, which is this idea of the Mexican government sort of opening up certain areas for a potential investment? We know the U.S., particularly Texas and Mexico, have that strong financial connection. Is there a chance that the petrochemical area in Mexico could be opened up for potential investment?
Well, here's, I think, the issue with Mr. Lopez Obrador. I think we have to understand that he's a nationalist. He's as nationalist as Mr. Trump, but he's a kind of an inward-looking nationalism, and he's a nationalist that also, like Mr. Trump and like many leaders in the world, dream of some epoch, some era that's long gone, that probably didn't even exist, that make America great again, that make Pemex great again in Mexico, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of political discourse, and it's our job to sort of sort out through it, look at the facts, and see what's going on. Yes. Mr. Lopez Obrador, in my view, has clearly said that over the last 30, 35 years, Mexico has allowed its national industry to decay, to be snuffed by these free trade agreements with the world. Mexico is probably the country that has the most free trade agreements than any other nation in the world. But all this investment that has come in and has overwhelmed the competitiveness of Mexican industry. And so Mr. Lopez Obrador is committed to revitalizing and reviving the Mexican energy industry, the Mexican food industry, the Mexican timber industry, and on and on. So clearly he has a different agenda than NAFTA, than the USMCA. And this is probably why he's not pushing to replace NAFTA. He knows that NAFTA is there. If the USMCA is not approved, NAFTA will be there at the center of the table. Yes. It will guarantee some investment. But his idea is to reduce Mexico's dependence on other economies. And in that sense, I think much of the business that is done with the United States, with Texas, and even Houston is probably at risk.
So when you say it's at risk, what specifically do you think the impact will be? Which industries? Because you focused in on Houston. This is where we are. So what do you think we take the hardest hit with that risk?
Clearly, Houston is very dependent on its energy industry, and that's key to Houston. I think the president has said in Mexico, this is not necessarily. This doesn't mean that he's going to be able to achieve that, okay, because there are some structural constraints to what he wants to do. But he clearly said we need to produce our own gasoline. Mexico is now importing anywhere between 70 to 80% of its gasoline from Texas. And a lot of the natural gas that goes from Texas into Mexico through these gas lines fuel Mexican manufacturing competitiveness. The president thinks this is too risky because with somebody as unreliable as Mr. Trump, when he decides to simply close the spigot, Mexico is going to be left out hanging. So clearly, the president has said we're going to build refineries, we're going to rehabilitate refineries, we're going to put Pemex back at the center. If anybody wants to do business, this is not a field of businesses in Mexico with Pemex, one among many players. This is a field with Pemex at the center and everybody doing business through Pemex.
And so one of the things I always try to do, no matter what form it is make sure people really understand, because I think a lot of times we have these high-level policy conversations and people are watching this. But essentially what you said is because of this spreading nationalism and essentially the rhetoric from our president, which is now forcing the Mexican president to say we need to look inwardly, means that we are going to pull further away from each other and with a wall that is far more than concrete. And essentially that could lead to Houstonians, you watching this show, losing jobs, right? If you're working in the energy industry, you're going to lose jobs. It could potentially impact what we're putting out into Mexico, which you said it's a percentage of how much that they're currently exporting from us?
It's about 60 to 80% of the gasoline going into Mexico now.
Well, that's a lot.
That's right. I mean, one of the structural issues, and I think Mr. Lopez Obrador is probably correct in pointing that out, is that Mexico is hardly self-sufficient on anything. Mexico imports most of its grain from the United States, exports vegetables and fruits, of course, but most of its gasoline, most of its natural gas, most of its 40% of its manufacturing inputs come from the United States. So clearly Mexico produces, if you look at almost anything that Mexico produces, Mexico is way below what it needs. And most of the gap between what it consumes, what it needs, and what it produces is made up by American imports. Yes. Mr. Lopez Obrador believes that this is unacceptable, this is not going to stand, and his intention is to continue to strengthen Mexican industry. And of course, that means less integration, that the model that the two countries and Canada pursued of a North American platform together into the future, all three countries, is not the model. Not the model that Mr. Trump is pursuing, not the model that Mr. Lopez Obrador is going to pursue. The end of it will probably be greater distance among all three partners.
But the truth is that Mexico does not have that infrastructure, the technology or expertise. Most experts will tell you that he is aiming very high in terms of being independent, and that even a country such as China that has that infrastructure, that technology, those experts, would be more likely to be able to achieve that. Certainly Mexico could not, given, again, that high bar that he is setting in terms of the next 6 years of trying to fix this. We know that Pemex has dug holes throughout Mexico, has spent billions of dollars trying to become, more efficient and having the expertise to try to get there, and they've not been successful thus far.
So you're skeptical. You're saying he can't.
I'm saying that there needs to be, and it's not how many jobs we're losing, it's the opportunity that we're losing to once again be countries that thrive because we are in the proximity that we are in, looking at this as an opportunity versus a threat.
Yeah, the irony of it, of course, is that the U.S. manufacturing base that slipped isn't slipped to Mexico. It's gone to China and Southeast Asia and other places. And so there would actually be an advantage if the U.S. and Mexico had a more closely symbiotic relationship. But I want to shift gears to a couple of things, because in order to do that, transportation is a huge component. Unfortunately, Southwest Airlines have announced recently they're cutting flights from Houston to Mexico City. I know, Dr. Murillo, I know you helped work on that and initially helped bring him to start that. What happened?
Well, it's a sad situation. I'll tell you, so many people were flying, and apparently from what we read in the papers that the flights were not filling to the level that they were anticipated to be filled at. What you also have is competition. You have some smaller airlines that have moved into hobby, et cetera. And the truth is, all of this, what it creates is this uneasiness, people not feeling comfortable about investing or traveling and doing things that normally they might do. So at the end of the day, this hurts business, this impacts travel, it impacts hospitality, all of the things that one thinks about in terms of travel, tourism, and the back and forth between the countries, and the opportunity to once again fill the gaps between what they have, what they need, and vice versa.
This is a really interesting opportunity to sort of examine the micro impacts of specific policies. I don't know much about the business model that Southwest put forth, but clearly there were two markets they were trying to target. One was the leisure market to Cancun, to Puerto Vallarta, and places like that. And the other one was obviously Mexico City, which was mostly focused on businessmen that travel to Mexico City and do business, right? Now, many companies, due to the uncertainty that NAFTA, the USMCA, Washington and Mexico City have created for the investment in the business community, travel is down. Business travel is down between the two countries, and that means it's down between Houston and Texas and Mexico. And so clearly, Southwest's model at the micro level ran into this kind of uncertainty that these policies have created, and they simply found it unprofitable to fly to Mexico City. I think they will continue to fly to the leisure places, but you know, will they affect the tourism industry eventually?
Absolutely.
We don't know.
So, again, shifting gears, one of the big topics of conversation when you talk about investment in business, when you talk about even the leisure markets, the corruption, and there's a lot of talk, a lot of article, a lot of documentation about the corruption that has happened in Mexico. I read an article where it said the former president was paid $100 million reportedly. How do you see that playing into the current climate, and what does Mexico do to get a hold of that?
Well, that's a very good question, because I think we are beginning to look at what Mr. Lopez Obrador's strategy would be to fight corruption. Clearly, he was elected to fight corruption. This was a big platform. In fact, if you look at the presidential debates, to almost every question he was asked, no matter what the subject, he would say, fighting corruption, fighting corruption, fighting corruption. Now, we look at three instances of how he's handling corruption. To prevent fuel theft, he simply shut down the pipelines. Said now he's gonna transport fuel by truck. That's more expensive. That's about 13, 14 times more expensive, so it's less efficient. I'm not sure that, you know, the gains from not having people steal fuel are worth the expenditure of transporting gasoline, but he's trying different ways. But the way to do it was to shut down the pipelines. Another important instance, for example, of, you know, his way of fighting corruption was there was a huge grant scam that used the universities to funnel money into these ghost programs and then use that money to finance political campaigns for the PRI. Mr. Payan did that. So now what he's done is it's cut the budget of all universities in Mexico by 30 to 40% to fight corruption, punishing the universities, punishing the students, punishing the education system to end corruption. So he freezes that. And obviously the so-called Ramo 23, which was a kind of a cash transfers from the federal government to the municipalities for public services, for public works, and so on, he cut it out. He said, look, this has been an opportunity for a lot of corruption, cutting it out. To me, it's like, well, you can fight corruption by simply stopping everything from moving, by simply suspending all services and all public works and in the airport in Mexico City. But how long is that going to last? Eventually, it's going to cost a lot.
Sure.
I think there are more efficient ways to fight corruption. But his way of doing it is this way, which means less business, less opportunities for binational business, and obviously I think there will be a price to pay. We haven't seen it yet, but it will be there.
Well, even something symbolic such as opening up Los Pinos to the general public the day after his inauguration and having over 30,000 people there. The fact that he's taken the salaries of government employees and capped them to a certain level, all of these symbolic, driving around his Volkswagen Jetta, etc., are ways for him to say corruption is over and done with. But as you talk to people in Mexico, they believe that the corruption has been there from the beginning and may take a different shape and form, and it's just a way of doing business that has been there always. And it's something that definitely must be addressed
And the counter to, or at least the flip side to the corruption argument has been the issue of narco trafficking and drugs here. And we know we've got the El Chapo trial going on in New York, but we still have sort of this structural problem, the Sinaloa drug cartels. And what is sort of the state of I guess, the drug war and AMLO's fight against, I guess, that element of it?
Well, he has very clearly said that he's not going to cooperate with the United States on fighting drug trafficking in the way the United States prefers to fight drug trafficking. The United States has a very simple way of fighting drugs, and that is to go through the to the kingpins and to get to them and capture them, extradite them, punish them, kill them, whatever that may be. But that, I think Mr. Lopez Obrador is convinced that when you behead an organization, others, lieutenants, immediately come up, and the organization just becomes more flexible, more supple, and so on. And so Mr. Lopez Obrador has said, look, that has cost Mexico hundreds of thousands of lives, trillions of dollars. We're not going to do that. And we're not going to deal with social conflict, whether it's the teachers, whether it's the unions, and so on, by deploying the police, and so on. He doesn't believe in that kind of approach with the purpose of lowering violence and lowering crime and so on. Well, I think the problem there is that you may be able to contain it for a little while, you may be able to reduce violence, but it doesn't solve a fundamental problem. You need to build institutions that will outlast individuals. One thing Mr. Lopez Obrador and Mr. Trump have in common: a huge ego and the conviction, the belief that everything depends on them, that they're the expert of everything, that they know everything, and that they're here to solve everything. They don't solve anything. We individuals come and go. We need to build the right institutions, and we need to leave the institutions for posterity. I think in the United States, the institutions are holding well against Mr. Trump, who has a very complicated relationship with institutions. Mr. Lopez Obrador doesn't really believe in institutions. He doesn't believe that he has to build them. He thinks that his moral leadership and his sheer presence in the presidency is enough to solve the country's problems. We've seen that in Latin America a lot. Individuals are not the solution. Institutions are.
Well, let's talk about that with Latin America, because we want to maybe broaden out the discussion for the last minute. We've got Venezuela, which is this massive crisis that's sort of affecting the region. Nicolas Maduro is holding on to power. Juan Guaido is the de jure president, in the sense that he's now been named, at least recognized by the U.S., Canada, et cetera. What's going to happen there, and how does Mexico and the U.S. have a role in potentially solving that problem?
Well, it's a very complicated conversation. Certainly, we feel for those folks who are in Venezuela, who are just going through deplorable situations. We have a large contingency of Venezolanos here in the Houston area, and so we are very concerned about their status. Certainly, headquartered here, we have Citgo. We know that some of their executives were recently arrested and still have not been released, so we've got that going on. And you look at the economy there and what has occurred, and the fact that you've got, different countries supporting Maduro and others supporting, Guaido as the de facto de jure, right, is certainly something that we must be cognizant about, and we need to realize that this will have very big unintended consequences as we look at our economy, as we look at the relationship with Latin America. It's going to be very critically important.
Real quick.
Here's what I think about Venezuela, and I think the situation in Venezuela. I'm not certain that Mr. Trump knows Venezuela, cares about Venezuela, so we have to look a layer below him to understand what are the motivations.
I get the feeling you're a fan of Mr. Trump.
Right. Clearly not. But we have to, if you want to talk about giving him credit for some things, perhaps we can talk about that. But on this particular issue, I'm not sure that he could not point to Venezuela on a map. I can assure you that he could not. Now, the problem with Venezuela here is that the opposition is pretty bad, has been pretty bad. Mr. Maduro is just awful, and the Venezuelans are crushed in this geopolitical game played by Russia, by China, and by the United States.
Yes.
I don't see a resolution if Mr. Maduro doesn't quit and goes away, or if it doesn't call for an election. I don't see a political resolution here. And what we may end up in a very dangerous scenario is that one side, the United States, will arm the opposition, and Russia will arm the government, the military, and we'll have a civil war. It is quite possible that we may end up in that scenario. Very quickly, in regards to Mexico, because I think it's really important you asked that question, Mexico has said, we got nothing to do with it. We don't want to take a side on that. We don't want to
We're
make a
out.
statement.
That's right.
And the United States has been very aggressive on that. So clearly, even in that, in vis-a-vis Latin America, the two countries are parting ways.
I tell you what, you know, it's our goal to bring experts here on Red, White, and Blue, and you two certainly are. I certainly have learned more about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Y'all have taken me on an emotional roller coaster. I don't know how to feel about this. One minute y'all were talking good about the president, and you're just like, hey, he's not going to actually succeed at any of this. But it's interesting to learn, and certainly interesting to learn how it affects our region. So thank you both for being here and being a part of the dialogue. Unfortunately, we are out of time, Jay.
We can go on for another
time
hour.
to say goodbye
I
to our viewers. And so we will see you next week. Join us for another episode of Red, White, and Blue.